This next volume in the series deals with catastrophism and books that promise to connect ancient myth to real catastrophe arrive these days with a certain predictability of tone, either a breathless certainty that the old stories have finally been decoded, or a brisk dismissal that treats the entire subject as beneath serious attention. What distinguishes the book in front of you is that it refuses both postures. It is willing to sit with a genuinely unresolved scientific debate, such as the cause of the Younger Dryas cooling, without pretending the matter is settled in either direction. It is willing to give a full and fair hearing to writers like Velikovsky and Hancock, whose central claims it ultimately rejects without reducing their work to caricature. And it is willing, again and again, to say plainly that a popular claim outruns its evidence, even when saying so makes for a less dramatic chapter. What results is not a book that tells you what to think about the relationship between myth and catastrophe, but one that shows you, case by case, how to weigh that question for yourself. What counts as independent corroboration? What a later theological accretion looks like once you know to look for it, and why the presence of a crater or the absence of one means less than either the credulous or the skeptical reader tends to assume. That discipline, applied consistently across solar physics, impact geology, comparative mythology, and the history of catastrophist writing itself, is the book's real achievement. And it is offered here in the hope that readers will carry its method with them long after they have closed the book on its specific conclusions. This book began with a simple, stubborn question. When a culture tells a story about the sky burning, the world ending, or a god hurling a weapon of fire, is it possible to say anything responsible about what, if anything, really happened? Most books that take up this question choose a side before the first chapter is finished. This one has tried deliberately not to. The method is stated plainly in chapters 2 and 3 and applied consistently for the following 39 chapters. Every source is graded into one of 4 categories: scientific and scholarly anchors, primary mythic and historical texts, historically significant catastrophist literature, and contemporary speculative interpretation, and every chapter moves through the same sequence from the mainstream account to the alternative interpretation under discussion to the strongest objections raised against it, to what genuinely remains unresolved. Readers will find, as a result, chapters that end in confident conclusion sitting alongside chapters that end candidly unresolved. And this is by design rather than a failure of nerve. Some questions this book examines are settled, some are not. Pretending otherwise, in either direction, seemed like the one genuinely unforgivable choice available to a book on this subject. I have tried throughout to take seriously both the scientists whose careful, incremental work rarely makes for gripping reading, and the popular writers, going back to Ignatius Donnelly in 1882, whose far more dramatic claims have shaped how millions of people think about this subject, regardless of whether professional specialists have accepted them. Both deserve to be read accurately rather than dismissed by reputation alone, and I hope this book has managed that balance more often than not. A note on structure. This book can be read straight through, following the argument from the firmest physical evidence toward the most speculative interpretive material and back again to synthesis, or consulted chapter by chapter as a reference on any single tradition or hypothesis a reader wants to understand better. Either way, the source grading and the 4-part chapter structure remain constant, and I would encourage any reader jumping directly to a single chapter to at least glance at chapters 2 and 3 first, since they explain the rules the rest of the book plays by. Trevor A. Toller, The End of the World is Memory. Every human culture that has left a record has also left, somewhere in that record, a story about the world ending. Floods drown the earth, and a handful of survivors rebuild it. Fire falls from the sky and burns away in age. A serpent, a dragon, or a monstrous flood mother is cut apart so that a new order can be built from the pieces. A world tree collapses and is replanted. A fifth world is destroyed by its own corruption, and a sixth begins in a narrower, more cautious form. These stories are not identical, and this book will resist every temptation to force them into a single template. But their recurrence is itself a fact that deserves an explanation, and there are, broadly, 3 ways of accounting for it, all of which will be tested throughout this book rather than assumed at the outset. The first is that world-ending stories are a natural product of human psychology and social experience, independent of any specific physical trigger. Every generation watches its elders die. Every kingdom eventually falls. Every institution a person is born into will not outlast them, and a species capable of foresight will inevitably produce myths that dramatize the fact of impermanence itself. The second is that at least some of these stories preserve in transformed and symbolic form the memory of real and specific catastrophic events. A flood that actually happened, a night the sky actually burned, a comet or a bolide that a community actually watched cross the horizon and vanish into the sea. The third, and the most difficult to weigh, is that the 2 explanations are not exclusive, that real events may have supplied the raw material, and psychological and social need may have supplied the shape, so that what survives in the historical record is neither pure observation nor pure invention, but an alloy of both, refined over many generations of retelling. This book takes the third possibility as its working premise, not because it is the most exciting of the 3, but because it is the one that the evidence, examined chapter by chapter, will not allow us to rule out. The idea of the last world, the world that existed before the one we currently inhabit, and that ended in some manner severe enough to require a new beginning, recurs with a persistence that is hard to explain by chance alone. From the Hopi accounts of worlds destroyed by fire, flood, and upheaval, to the Norse expectation of Ragnarok, to the Mesoamerican count of prior suns, each ended by a different mode of destruction. Whether any specific instance of this pattern encodes a specific physical event is a question. This book will take up tradition by tradition, source by source, always distinguishing what the primary text actually says from what later interpreters have wanted it to mean. But the pattern itself, world, ending, renewal, is common enough and old enough that dismissing it as mere coincidence would itself be a claim requiring evidence, not a neutral default. Plasma and electrical circuitry in the sky. Among the recurring images in world-ending myth, one deserves early introduction because it will return throughout this book in contexts ranging from the well-established to the frankly speculative, the sky as something that can discharge, arc, or ignite rather than simply burn or fall. The thunderbolt hurled by Indra, the hammer strike of Thor, the fire that Zeus and a dozen other sky gods rain down on the disobedient. All of these treat the sky not merely as a source of light and weather, but as a reservoir of violent, directed energy released suddenly and with lethal effect. It would be a mistake to read this imagery as a primitive attempt at describing a specific modern concept such as a terrestrial gamma-ray flash or a coronal mass ejection. The people who told these stories had no such vocabulary, and imposing it on them risks the same error in the opposite direction, turning myth into disguised physics rather than reading it as physics's possible raw material. At the same time, the physical sky is more electrically active than casual observation suggests, and this book treats that established fact as a floor beneath the more speculative chapters that follow, rather than as evidence for any particular reading of myth. Ordinary lightning is only the most visible part of a much larger picture that includes terrestrial gamma-ray flashes, brief, powerful bursts of high-energy radiation generated by Earth's own thunderstorms and only identified by instruments in the last few decades, sprites, jets, and other transient luminous events in the upper atmosphere, and the broader question of how the Sun's own particle and radiation output couples into Earth's atmosphere during extreme events. None of this licenses the conclusion that ancient thunderbolt imagery is a coded record of gamma-ray flashes or coronal discharge. That leap belongs, when it is made at all in this book, squarely in the interpretive and speculative source category, clearly labeled as such. What the established science does license is a more modest but still important claim that the sky was and is a far more violent and electrically active place than a modern reader's mental image of calm blue day and starry night would suggest, and that this fact alone makes the recurring language of celestial fire, weapon, and discharge deserves to be taken seriously as something more than empty metaphor. What the anomalies suggest. Some of the evidence this book will weigh comes not from myth or history, but from the recent instrumented record of the solar system itself, and one example belongs here because it illustrates, in miniature, the kind of patient reasoning the chapters ahead will try to model. Measurements of the ratio of deuterium to ordinary hydrogen, a ratio that serves planetary scientists as a kind of chemical fingerprint of where and when a body's material originally formed, show that Saturn's atmosphere is measurably depleted in deuterium relative to Jupiter's and depleted in the opposite direction from what standard models of planet formation predict. Researchers analyzing Cassini spacecraft data have been explicit that no widely accepted theory currently explains why Saturn's ratio should be lower than Jupiter's rather than higher, and have laid out several competing physical explanations, from preferential loss processes to deep sequestration of deuterium in the planet's interior without settling on one. Separately, isotope measurements of Saturn's outer moon, Phoebe found the highest deuterium to hydrogen ratio yet recorded anywhere in the solar system, strongly suggesting that Phoebe itself formed far beyond Saturn in the cold outer solar system before arriving in its current orbit. None of this is presented here as proof of anything beyond what it plainly says, that the outer solar system's formation history still contains real, acknowledged, peer-reviewed puzzles, and that Saturn's system in particular preserves chemical evidence of material that did not originate where it now sits. It is this kind of open, mainstream anomaly that some interpretive and speculative writers have tried to build much larger structures upon. Dave Talbot and other writers associated with what is often called Saturn theory or the capture scenario hypothesis have proposed since the 1970s that the early solar system underwent a far more dramatic and electrically active reconfiguration than standard planetary science allows, in which Saturn itself is imagined to have occupied a different, more central role before some later rearrangement locked the planets into their present orbits. This book treats that body of writing as Category D, an explicitly interpretive and speculative tradition, discussed later at length because of its influence on a certain strand of popular catastrophism and its attempt to connect planetary science with mythic material such as the thunderbolt imagery discussed above, but never treated as an accepted account of solar system history. The isotope anomalies are real and repay understanding on their own terms. The capture scenario literature built on top of them is a separate, much more speculative structure, and this book keeps the two apart wherever they appear together. An open investigation. What follows, across 8 parts and 42 chapters, is an attempt to hold two things in mind at once without letting either one collapse into the other. The discipline of the sciences that study solar activity, atmospheric physics, impact events and planetary formation, and the testimony of the myths, oral traditions, and illustrated manuscripts that generations of human beings produced in an effort to explain what they they had witnessed or believed they had witnessed, or needed to believe in order to make sense of loss on a civilizational scale. The book will move between tree rings and Vedic hymns, between Cassini spectrometer data and Hopi world cycle narratives, between the well-documented physics of the Chelyabinsk airburst and the far less certain territory of petroglyph interpretation and capture scenario cosmology, always trying to say plainly which kind of ground it is standing on at any given moment. This will mean disappointing readers who want a single unified answer, because the plain answer, chapter after chapter, is likely to be some version of "this remains unresolved." It will also mean taking seriously, more seriously than either strict mainstream skepticism or enthusiastic fringe advocacy usually allow, the possibility that both camps are, in different ways, half right. That the sky really has done violent and history-altering things within the span of human memory, that some cultures really may have encoded fragments of those events in their sacred stories, and that establishing which fragments are which, and how much confidence any of it deserves, is slow, comparative, source-graded work rather than a single dramatic revelation. The chapters that follow are an attempt at that work, undertaken in the belief that the question of whether the last world's ending left traces in the myths of the next one is too important and too interesting to answer carelessly in either direction. How a sky becomes a god. Granting that a real event might survive in memory, one must still ask what such survival would look like, because a myth is never a transcript. Between the witnessed occurrence and the recorded story lie many generations of retelling, and comparative folklore suggests that this passage works transformations that are, in a rough way, predictable. Natural forces tend to be personified so that a discharge in the sky becomes a weapon in a god's hand and a flood becomes the wrath or grief of a named being. Durations collapse. An episode that unfolded over hours or days is compressed into a single decisive act, or conversely, a brief event is stretched to fill an age. Details migrate toward the sacred center of a culture, attaching themselves to its most important places, ancestors, and rituals regardless of where the original event occurred. These tendencies cut both ways for the argument of this book, and candor requires holding both edges at once. On one hand, they mean that the absence of literal astronomical detail in a myth is no evidence against a real event behind it. One should not expect an ancient account of a bolide to read like an observatory log, and demanding that it do so would be a category error. On the other hand, the same transformations make the interpreter's task treacherous, because a sufficiently flexible set of decoding rules can extract a sky event from almost any story, and the writers this book later classes as categories C and D have often done precisely that, reading thunderbolts and captured planets into imagery that supports many other readings equally well. The discipline that this predicament demands is the one the book has already committed itself to begin from what a primary text actually says, to state plainly what physical event, if any, is being proposed, and to ask whether independent evidence, a crater, a tree ring anomaly, an ice core signal, a dated eruption, corroborates the reading or merely fails to contradict it. A transformation model that explains everything explains nothing, and the value of understanding how events become stories lies less in licensing bold decodings than in disciplining them. By making clear how much interpretive distance separates a burning sky from the god who is later said to have thrown the fire.